Everybody, thank you, Effie. You do well. I'm happy to be here, and I imagine both of you are as well. And this is great because lots of the people in this festival, being featured in this festival, are friends. So it has just been like honestly hanging out with very close friends, and many of us started on this journey together. Like we've seen each other on the come up, which even makes this conversation even more rewarding, right? Because that's part of what we are going to talk about, what it means to step away and think about the culture sort of in its evolution and trajectory. And three of us particularly, we are friends, so I'm glad. This is not like a typical, I just feel like I'm hanging out with my homies, and we're going to talk about something that we really feel passionate about, which is, just what does media look like when it's actually doing something that is culture shifting and that is trying to change the narrative. I know we all know each other's projects intimately, but I imagine that there are other people in the audience who might just know of us vaguely or, might not really know what our project is about. So I was thinking maybe we can just start from just kind of going back to the beginning when it all started. We're bright-eyed and just ready to change the world of media. Take us to that moment. What inspired your projects? What did you want? What was the intervention that you wanted to make? And just kind of how has things sort of evolved until now? I'll start with Bhakti.
Thanks, Ainehi. It's true. We're all just hanging out and we're friends. And the timeline is particularly interesting to me because all these projects, Brittlepaper, Africa's a Country, Warscapes, they all started like 2009, 2010, 2011. And of course, they have been probably brewing in our heads forever, but it was a very early stage, of course, of digital media. And I think all of us started with these born digital online projects because it was the cheapest and quickest intervention one could make into what we saw as a media that was impossible to penetrate, where it was established, old guard kind of voices at all times. The thing for me in particular was I was very much shaped by being in New York, doing my PhD in New York, right as the towers, 9/11 happened, the towers fell, and that was my first coming of age in trying to understand, why is everything so Islamophobic? Why is all the perspective just so Western? Why is there such an extraordinary drumming up support for wars in places and things like that? And so Warscapes started as a way to shed light on journalism, books, writing, poetry about war that wasn't coming from a Western perspective. And right when we started, in fact, we were flooded with submissions from, war veterans, American war veterans, a lot of essentially combat narratives. And what I realized early on is that's exactly what I don't want to publish. I'm not going to, it's not warscapes because we're telling cool war stories of fighting in whatever places, that really it's, war is just a lens, and war was a lens to understand trauma, displacement, what happens to women, what happens to children, and war is also a lens to understand the extremely creative, stylistic, interesting, beautiful ways in which war and peace and violence is written about. So I think that became Warscapes, and it was many, many genres at the time. We would divide them in the categories, which I don't know if it's trendy anymore to do those things, but we had poetry, book reviews, op-eds, journalism, and thinking like a traditional newspaper, but it was all online. And it was a long journey to understand that producing stuff online, creating online interventions was so different from what print could do and couldn't do, and I have gone back and forth between both mediums over time. The other crazy thing was 2011 was the Arab Springs, or what I'd say African Spring, really, and that changed our use of Twitter. that changed our use of Facebook and social media, and those became instrumental and got fed into this kind of online production machine. These interventions we were making became very tied to social media and things like that, and that changed the forms as well. And I think what we're seeing today is that we have, social media then got co-opted by all the big news organizations, this, that, and the other, but we are in a very particular moment now with the ongoing genocide in Palestine, where we are seeing that the mainstream media is finished. Like social media, people documenting themselves and their own suffering and what is happening to them every day has completely changed the landscape. So I feel like 9/11, Arab Spring, all these things are going on, and we are back again in some stage where things are totally falling apart, but within that, something radical perhaps could emerge.
Before we go to Sean, I just wanted to kind of highlight something that you said. So the kinds of failures we are seeing in major media spaces today didn't start today, at least, right? Because that's partly what inspired your establishment of Warscapes. But I mean, has the failures become different or intensified? So from what you saw that made you create Warscapes and what we are seeing today, where you're literally, for people to be able to kind of make their suffering visible, they have to go out on their own. Like, what has really changed? How has the failure then, how is it different from the failures that we're seeing today?
Yeah, I mean, I've been thinking about that in some way, and of course, since yesterday you told us we'd talk about this too. One of the things, as people wanting to create new media, as people wanting to do these interventions, we always believed that representation mattered, that if you just showed the photograph, like the girl in Vietnam where the napalm had gone to her back and she ran there, like it changed the course of the Vietnam War. It changed how people viewed it. It changed news production. It made support for the war less, it lessened support for the war. So there's always been this belief that media can bring about a paradigm shift. And what we are seeing now is the failure of that paradigm. It's like, I'm seeing this stuff every day. Children crushed in the rubble. I'm seeing the people in Sudan, like catastrophic levels of hunger and like an impossibility to shape political policy. Impossibility. So that's what's new to me, is that something I believed in has broken. And so I'm at a loss now. So what's different about this moment is that I felt media was always shitty and racist, but then you'd have these, they were always colonial, they were always anti-black, anti-Muslim, but then you would have these moments where it felt like you could change public opinion because of a picture, because of a post, or because of something. And that's where I'm lost today. I don't know.
I feel like that's something that we're going to come back to when we think about what the radical is and just whether a kind of utopian imagination of the media is still possible. But Sean, can you just kind of take us back and kind of tell us about AIC, Africa is a Country?
Okay, thanks for having me, Ainehi. It's always good to be with both of you on platforms. So I would say that for Africa is a Country, by the way, was started in 2009. But so what I quickly want to talk about is what I think was the immediate impetus for Africa as a Country, and then I think there's a larger context. So the immediate one was, that is similar to Bhakti. I had also been kind of writing online. Actually, I don't know, everybody, my first time I wrote online when I was a student was on something called Voice of the Turtle. That's interesting that people... No, well, I wrote for this publication, which was a bunch of grad students in Britain. And I'll remember the guy's name later, but I wrote for that. And then I had written I worked in South Africa in political research, and I'd written online publications there. But I then started my own publication, to Bhakti's point, Leo Africanus. I imagined myself as this 15th century Moroccan diplomat who had been kidnapped by pirates who had swore allegiance to the Pope. And when he got to Rome, he worked for the Pope. His original name was Hassan al-Wazan. And he wrote a book called The Description of Africa. And in this book, he would make up things, but he would also tell truth, and he would also critique how people talk and wrote and spoke about Africa. And so I imagined myself as his like modern incarnation. At some point, I realized very few people were reading this website, and that I had to come up with a gimmick. And so then I came with this gimmick roughly around 2009 by renaming it as Africa's Country. But the more important point was, similar to Bhakti, this was a response to, I had moved to New York. I was a grad student, actually at the University of London, but because of some personal kind of coincidences. By the way, it's my 23rd wedding anniversary today. So because of that coincidence, I was in New York, and it was post 9/11, and being in that context where the New York Times writes about Africa in a particular kind of way, humanitarian crisis, war, Africans have no real voice in it, I realized the internet was democratizing our access and our ability to write back. So that's when Africa's a Country started. Initially, and I won't do the whole history, but initially what we did was, it was media critique. And after a while, we moved away from media critique because of these changes that Bhakti is describing, Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, where most people could then also directly participate in the debate. So then what Africa's a Country did was, it moved to become like a proper journal, an online journal that did, opinion pieces. I mean, both of them have contributed to Africa's a Country, by the way. So it just became a place of opinion, of ideas, rather than just merely being reactive. Quickly, on the more like larger context for why I did this, I said I'm from South Africa, and South Africa had a long tradition of, under extreme conditions of apartheid, oppression, racism, where Black South Africans did produce really brilliant magazines, not online, but these were like underground magazines, particularly at the worst period in South Africa's history during the 1980s. You may have come across something called Staff Rider, which is a literary magazine, Work in Progress, the South African Labor Bulletin. I was in high school, I mean, this tells you how old I am, in the late 1980s, and reading this stuff was incredible. Like newspapers like the Mail and Guardian. And so, ironically, at this very dark period in South Africa, there was this kind of publication that I was now trying to emulate online. And then the second thing, because South Africans are very parochial, I was always reading in high school about the rest of the continent, reading about liberation movements that were kind of imagining things from the diaspora, London, New York, whatever. And so the other publication that really inspired me was Transition. I don't know if people have come across this, started by Rajat Nioji, who was an Indian Ugandan, and it's an incredible publication. In the 1960s, it had its high point where anybody from Kwame Nkrumah to Wole Soyinka, Masrui, Nadine Gordimer were debating on the pages of this publication. And again, I wanted to recreate that online. So that, I would say generally that, there's a lot more I could say, but that's generally how I think about the history of the project. Oh, just one correction, I'm not the editor anymore. I'm only the publisher now. We have a new editor called Will Shoki. Yeah.
It's been handed to the youth.
It has. Yeah, it feels generational now, like we are the old guard now. And yeah. So, I mean, I think that we're already kind of talking about history a bit, and I want us to maybe give attention to that a little bit and then come back to our moment. So you mentioned this kind of spaces in South Africa at the heart of one of the most authoritarian, just oppressive regimes you can imagine, that writers and thinkers are finding spaces where they are doing radical things. So maybe that might be a way for us to think about the term radical, right? Like how you guys understand what this term is. We did not invent it. And to me, it feels like it's one of those terms that people abandon and reclaim from time to time. But sometimes, like a term such as intersection, right? Intersectional. It could feel as if it's this thing that means everything, And it also feels like a very historical term in the sense that what radical meant for Ngugi's generation, you know, and what radical means for us today might be different. So seeing that that's sort of a framework that we are using to think about how warscapes and Africa as a country is positioned in relationship to mainstream media, I just wanted us to maybe unpack that term a little bit to say, how do you understand this term?
I feel like there's a conflict of interest because I closed down Warscapes and transitioned into what I call the Radical Books Collective, you know. So I spent a lot of time thinking because I wanted to move Warscapes from the magazine format where we were getting submissions, editing them, publishing them, to what COVID made me feel was that what we needed was to come together as a community, that yes, we were all physically distancing, but then socially we were all getting closer and closer. And so I transitioned Warscapes into what is called the Radical Books Collective, and I thought a lot about what that term means. And the problem of that term is that it can go either way, right? It can be radically progressive or it can be radically right-wing. And it's a very difficult term to own and to work with because we are living like the extraordinary radical right-wing nightmare in Europe and, you know, in most places. I mean, even in Kenya, even in lots of places. So it's a very hard term to make work, and it always has to come with explanations. But I think what I get from it in a sort of, you know, quotes from Angela Davis or even Marx or whatever, you know, is that you have to engage the term in a complete, in its extreme stubborn violence. Like it has to connote a kind of violence, you know, in like this has to end and something else has to emerge from it. So I see it in an almost like a Fanonian sense, a very important term that signifies a violent break. And I keep attempting to do that. Like I started Radical Books Collective, which was online book clubs. You know, people were in COVID and the world had been so bought by the mainstream 5 publishers that there is not one piece of knowledge that wouldn't be somehow filtered through the big 5 paradigm and diluted down. All important concepts were being diluted down. And so the idea was that we have these book clubs and we read maybe difficult books and we work through them together. Maybe the author visits sometimes. And it's a difficult countercultural thing to do because book clubs is Oprah Winfrey, it's Reese Witherspoon, it's celebrity stuff, it's also whittling down of ideas, it's tied up with celebrity culture and book sales, and I'm saying let's do the opposite, let's violently break from that. So let's read radical books, whatever that means, you know. So I think there has to be a stubborn faith in wanting to break something.
So a stubborn faith in wanting to break something. So, and this is
religious. I sound religious.
No,
which is fine.
But there is a kind of fervor, right?
Fervor.
With it, there is fervor. There is a sense in which you are. You have to be. You're almost a militant, totally. Right? You have this belief in something, in the possibility of something that everyone else has said it's not possible. And you say, no, it's possible, and let's make space for it. And so before I move on to you, I want to kind of maybe layer on the idea of the utopian with the radical to see if, you know, that's maybe something that you could, you know, layer into your response.
I mean, so I would say, and I specifically in terms of how I've always thought about Africa as a country and how we've worked as Africa as a country, I would say there's sort of 2 ideas that kind of guided the work. One was, what's the phrase you just said, Bhakti? You wanted to?
Stubborn faith.
Stubborn faith. Our stubborn faith was to, and I just wrote it down here, like a structural critique.
Exactly.
And the structural critique has to be accompanied by an idea that there should be a transformation in society. We want something else. And in that something else, I would say Africa as a country from the beginning said it's not a halfway house. To your point, we are not going to publish every and anything. It's a political project. We have the lineage that I just mentioned, the South African leftists, black radical leftist kind of lineage, the lineage of the 1960s. That's who we write ourselves into. That's what we are going to do. It's going to be anti-elitist, it's anti-capitalist, anti-colonial, and we're gonna champion popular democratic politics. Now, that popular democratic politics is not entirely new. It has happened in Africa where people, full of contradictions, not perfect, have thought about some other kind of politics, whether they Thomas Sankara, not to a point where we fetishize them, but there's, I use the word usable past. There's something useful in how those people like railed against oppression and tried to imagine something else. Even Fela Kuti, for all his contradictions, I also think he gets a raw deal from writers in the West that don't understand what he's trying to do, and so they just focus on the sensational. But we are trying to show the usable past, but then also recognizing something, when something new is happening right in front of you, we are open to it, like, and I think it's partly, and yeah, I think it's about practice. In Africa as a country, I always believe that I cannot just work with my peers. I constantly have to bring younger people in because they have a totally different experience about their reality, whether that's how they thought about the efficacy of, I don't know, liberation, how they thought about the 1990s, the end of the Cold War. Like, so fees must fall, roads must fall, as it was developing in South Africa. We embraced it immediately. And SARS, whether these things are full of contradictions, Africa as a country is there to support new political ideas. The one that I'm actually fascinated by at the moment is this guy, Fuse ODG. I don't know if everybody's seen this reel that is sort of viral, where he's standing in front of like Buckingham Palace, Big Ben, some streets in London, and he has the song called Sundiata that has incredible lyrics. I mean, I actually wrote it down before I came here. I'm not gonna curse. He says, there's a silent war up in DRC. If your poverty porn and the thrills you seek, the new Africa is born to fulfill the dream. Now, I read it like in this very boring monotone, but you have to hear this Afro beat that comes with it. And just the last part, he says, I know there's powers that be shielding me. I told them from Band Aid to BBC that we Africans who know what the children need, so fall back, we can kick it on our own. This is just an artist doing this on Instagram, but I think what I love about Africa as a country was that's how Africa as a country thought about radical. It's always ready to embrace and be open to something is not perfect, but we think that there's a possibility there for some interesting politics.
And I imagine that the role of the media is critical as well, because it's one thing for something radical to happen, and it's another thing for that radical event or incident or message or moment to be captured and then archived and then made visible.
Yeah, I mean, I'll just add one thing to what you just said. That's a very good way to put it, is that I think the thing about engaging with sort of radical things, that it's very easy, it's always easy to say, hey, I'm going in this radical route, I'm going to break shit, I'm going to break it, I'm going to burn it, I'm going to dismantle, I'm going to abolish, all of that kind of stuff. And I think the most important aspect of the radical thing is building up again. So that's why, like, we are the radical books. We are championing radical books, but we're the Radical Books Collective, and we're going to do it together, and we're going to build that universe, because I can say divest from these and these brands that support Israel and that are anti-Palestinians. But it's also important to invest. You know, it's like you have to break it down, but you also have to build, and that's the sick lesson we are learning now from the radical right-wing movement. They're breaking everything down, but they're building this whole thing on the side, you know, and. So radicalism gets a bad rep because it's always associated with breakage and burning, but I think radical has to work alongside building.
Right. This is just reminded me, when you say burn it all, of Black Panther, right? Killmonger versus T'Challa. So there's that moment where Killmonger says, I'm going to burn it all. And it's sort of captured as this scary moment, you know, of a political vision that wants to send the world into complete entropy, right? And then the possibility, though, is a kind of UN type of figure in T'Challa who is supposed to uphold.
Or Bill Gates.
Right, you know?
Gates at the end.
That's so, it's how do we break that type of dichotomy where it's either, you know, we have the vision of the radical who wants to destroy everything and lead to the end of the world, or this person who is essentially just reproducing the same structural system. Like, what's the way out of those types of, you know, binary?
If I can go quickly on that, I think what Africa as a country, as I said, there's a new editor. There is somebody called a director of operations, Boima Tucker. I don't know if everybody's encountered Boima's work. And the editor is somebody called Will Shoki. And I think the way, I've sort of now lost my, because I was trying to I'm always trying to big up them so people don't assume that there aren't new editors there. But I'm trying to get back my train of thought now. What was I? So now I got to go back to this is terrible that I'm totally having this blank now. But no, I think what I was going to say is what Africa as a country has done, and this goes back to my point about being open and being sort of, the phrase I always used to say, it's a house with many rooms. And so you actually ask us, I'm sort of trying to answer something else that you asked us, we were chatting beforehand, which is what Africa as a country realized was if we don't want to get stale and if we have to be open to other ideas, then we cannot be prescriptive. Actually, that was the point I was going to try to make. We cannot be prescriptive as to what is politically possible. Exactly. And so that means we have to open up the space. Yes, we have editors. Yes, I'm based in New York City. Boima, at that point, I think he was based in Brazil. Will was based in Johannesburg, and then he has now moved to Cape Town. But what we've done is we basically, from the beginning, said there's an imbalance between the ideas that are circulating in the West, where we are, and what we're doing often is we are reacting. We're mostly reacting to bad press, horrible stereotypes, and as a result, I think Bhakti sort of alluded to this, our political imagination can't grasp that there's something else. So we said, you know what? We need to have more writers who are based on the African continent. We need to deal with this imbalance. So what they've done is they've actually appointed a whole bunch of regional editors, given them way more power. So there's somebody in Nairobi, there's somebody in Lagos, Sahid Husseini, in Algiers. There's an editor in South Africa. There's two editors, I think, here in New York, where one is responsible for the Francophone world. So kind of breaking out of that so that those voices that people don't hear and in which we often, I think, we end up sort of defining and being prescriptive. So we said, let's open up the space so we can hear more of the ideas that are coming out of the continent. Because the stuff I mentioned, Fees Must Fall, profoundly, I would argue, had a very organic.
What is Fees Must Fall? Just for people who may not know.
In between 2015 and so Black Lives Matter happened here in the U.S. roughly 2013, but really picked up after 2014, and I think its height was 2020. So in South Africa, there was a movement between 2015 and 2017 by students. The movement was like two movements at once. Rhodes Must Fall, which was to explicitly ask that statues glorifying colonial era figures like Cecil John Rhodes and others should be removed from public spaces, particularly campuses. And then the second movement was called Fees Must Fall, which argued that you should drop university tuition, make universities free and public. But with it, they also came with a critique of patriarchy. They came with a critique of neoliberalism. They talked about not to outsource the jobs that the people were doing on campuses. And what I'm saying is organically, I think there was an interesting relationship between those movements and movements that were happening here, that were happening at Oxford with Fees Must Fall in Oxford, and influencing each other. And so to my point is, I'm suggesting that we learned quickly that what the people in Africa, I'm not saying necessarily they had lessons to give, or they could teach people in the North something, but there were politics happening there that we could at least, you could look at it, and you could see you could learn some tactics from it, which I think if you're just in the West and all you do is being reactive, you miss out on that.
I think maybe this is a good place to talk about positionality and how it affects radical projects. We have a mutual friend who believes that you can never build a radical project that is connected to the continent, that is not grounded in the continent. That so Africa is a country is based in the US, Radical Boost Collective and Warscapes is based in the US, Brittlepaper is based in the US. And for him, those types of projects, there's so much that you can do. You have to be on ground on the continent in order to really radically shift culture in ways that matter. What do you guys think of that provocation?
I'll be quick. I mean, I sort of said already, the more recently, Africa as a country is based on the continent. I mean, this is that's why I'm not gonna spend too much time on it. I'm not disrespecting your question. I'm just saying, like, we decided consciously that we have to break with the US being based in the US. So Will Shoki, the editor, is based in Cape Town. Poema Taka was based, as I said, in Brazil, at points in Bolivia, I think in Peru. So not in the US. Sometimes he's in the US, in the Midwest. But he's based now, I think, more outside the continent. Recently, we had a Festival of Ideas. We could have had that Festival of Ideas here in the US. It was in Nairobi. We've had other public events that we stream. They would be held in Nigeria, in Abuja. There was one in Johannesburg. So getting physically, and I mean, you know, I've worked with Antonio and Chumurenga, so I know his criticism is well taken. And I think I struggled with that when I was editing Africa as a Country, that here I was in the West, and I was mostly writing about how Africans were trying to make sense of the world. So that's when I said we opened up, we created an editorial board, we created a list of contributing editors, but we still struggled because I was the editor with that kind of imbalance. And so by stepping to the side, I'm hoping that that imbalance gets somewhat taken care of, yeah.
I mean, I think it's a very valid point to...
And maybe like it's not so much, you know, for you to defend what you do, but to maybe think about what is implied in that provocation, in the kind of power structures that ground the type of radical work that we are trying to do.
Absolutely. And I do think like connection to place, or to have something emerge from a place that's local. And Ainehi, you and I have, all of us have been part of, like in academia, the horrible moment where everybody was talking about the word glocal, which is the mix of the global and the local. And it's, let's safely say it's over now, that nonsense. But of course, it's important. It's like how does the local shape the world and the world shape the local? And to have an awareness of the dynamics. I mean, part of the question for me is also a question of one's ego, right? If you're the founder, if you are executive director, editor-in-chief, whatever fancy title you give yourself, to which funders give money and this, that, and the other, it's like, how do you view yourself? You know, and I think part of sometimes of radical projects and to allow local knowledge to emerge, local knowledge production to circulate, is to work hard at getting rid of that ego. To, you know, one of the things, one of my big insights was a lot of people at some point knew Warscapes, but they had no idea who I was. And I was reading about Gwyneth Paltrow, who had started Goop, and it was considered the most innovative thing on earth because Gwyneth is Goop, the person is the brand is the person. And I was like, oh, you know, like I kind of missed out. Like, I wish I was more famous, you know. And you have to catch yourself right there in that moment, you know, and to be like, what is it like that you really, what is the goal of this in some way, you know? And you can just be the vessel. You have to be the person, if you get funding, how you're going to spread that money for stuff that comes out of those local places you care about or write about, or which writers you want to amplify, which podcasts you want to, you know, distribute and things like that. So I think some of it, you know, I think we can't ever anymore dismiss the importance of the diaspora and the way in which it deeply dominates conversation. Like, we can't talk about Africa without its diaspora. We can't talk about blackness without thinking about blackness as it situates everywhere. And I would say the same about the thing that I try to combat more: anti-Muslim hatred, Islamophobia, Hindu fundamentalism coming from India, and so on. And like, the diaspora is so extricately tied, you know, but I just think that as people wanting to make radical interventions, like, one of the big intervention has to happen on the self, and be like, where is my ego? Who am I in this? And what can I facilitate versus what can I do for myself? And sometimes I see projects that get lost, where it's just like, what's happening, you know? Who are you? What are you doing, you know?
Right, the eternal leader, but I mean, that is a sort of built-in, what do you call it, like a glitch in small publications, is that the founder has an outsized like influence. Yeah. This is just true. So it's like, as you said, it's like how you manage that process. Luckily for me, I think I came out of, I'm a sort of a product of that like late 1980s, early 90s. That's when I'm like formed in South Africa, sort of very kind of radical journalism. I was also a journalist at one point, where what you're doing is in service of this larger political movement, and I would argue I carried that with me into Africa as a country. I want to make one other quick point just quickly. I don't want to be misconstrued. I actually think that the struggle around transformation, structurally transforming, creating more popular democratic, like things that where Africans actually live full lives. I think that's, for me, it's about living full lives. I think it's at its best when the diaspora and the people on the continent like drive it together. There's a new book by Howard French, who's up here at Columbia, called The Second Emancipation, about the life of Kwame Nkrumah. I'm reading it now. And is he around? Yeah. He's here tomorrow. I mean, and if you read it, it shows you how with Nkrumah, the project of Nkrumah around African liberation, he was fed by being here in the U.S. And throughout his life, he kind of emphasized that connection, whether through his personal connection with the boys or his connection to the civil rights struggle, etc. But I think for me, that's when it works at its best. And that's why I'm emphasizing this point of what I call this kind of organic, very creative relationship between the movements that were happening in South Africa and the movements that were happening here.
And I think that also works for Fela as well, right? Mm-hmm. He's coming to the US and being connected with sort of the Black Panther world, and that adding to how he became, kind of this radical figure. So yeah, that relationship, I think, is very important, and is very key. And so the question is simply, like, how do we navigate the complexities of that relationship? Being that we in the West have access to certain kinds of resources, there's already a power relation. And how do we harness that in a way that does not reproduce the same types of, problematic relationships that we are critiquing in the kind of more geopolitical and cultural space? If you have questions, begin to sort of formulate your ideas. I'm getting to the end of my questioning.
I mean, I think I'll add again to what you said about coming at it from a movement building perspective, and I think it is so hard in the US to engage with notions of the collective. We're all in academia, and there is one word in academia that I hate with all my heart. It's called the monograph. Have you written your monograph? Which in itself is like the mono of it, the mono of it. And it's very hard to divest from those structures where individual amplification, individual progress, individual promotion. So we are surrounded by that. But I think to constantly sort of push ourselves to remain grounded on something larger than the self is the only way to make tyrannical, potentially radical interventions.
But it also means like actively trying. When you say I'm not going to reproduce elite discourse, then I think you kind of like have to show that you're not going to do it. Like one example that I always remember was there was a magazine that was being produced in Tanzania in Swahili, and it was being circulated like to regular people, you know, like a free newspaper in Swahili. And they would cover things like explaining sort of the quest for a proper public transport system. And they had like a cogent argument, like almost theoretical, about why you need public transport. They ran stories about cooperative banks, but it was in Swahili. So we had a project with them where we translated those articles into English without changing much, except that, say, a person in Nairobi or somebody in Ghana or wherever could read it and relate to it. So that was to bring in kind of popular debates that people are having outside of these sort of the spaces where we are, the university, and make it possible. We had another project with a group operating in Kibera in Nairobi, where we trained some of their young journalists. They started making short films for us. They produced articles that were being published both in English and in Sheng, which is this kind of local Swahili that they speak in Nairobi. That was published on Africa as a Country in all those languages and linking to all of them. If there was a young scholar that was getting together a whole bunch of people for a symposium on, say, religion and African democracy, we would go to them and say, you had like 7 or 8 papers at this conference. Let's talk about reproducing 900-word versions of some of the arguments that were made there and rewrite them in a way so that somebody who's not a professor can read them, relate to it, and get something out of it. So that sort of, I'm not around for African countries every day now, but that's how I thought about how you break through this wall of just, it's always us talking about on the page or on the net and broadening it out. And again, for me, those lessons came from those magazines that I grew up with in South Africa in the 1980s. Yeah,
and I think, this is something that both of you are very invested in. Or I think that we all are. Yeah. We started doing public facing before it became a buzzword in university. Like in my university now, it's like, are you doing public facing?
Oh, they didn't. I get very little credit when I started with this.
Absolutely. I mean, the kinds of conversations I used to have with chairs of department who just did not know how to give value to Brittlepaper. They would say, how many words do you write in this thing? There was just zero way to figure out what the thing is, right? So now in the universities, it's important to have a public-facing project. But this is something that we started doing over a decade ago. That university as a site of knowledge production, right, has come under a lot of criticism of late, right? Where communities feel like these are just overfunded behemoths, right? That for them, they don't quite get what the value is, especially for public institutions like the ones that I work in, that are massive and huge. And that what I seem to be hearing you guys say is that there is a kind of radical intervention that says, how can we take the knowledge we are making, right, or stewarding in the university and creating a space where it can intersect with the knowledge that is also being created in the community outside? And how do you create that sort of magical space where a new type of discourse and conversation can happen? And it gets to your points about community or collectivity being at the heart of the radical. And that the radical is not just an idea. Actually, what makes it radical is that it creates new collectivities. And that is why it's also dangerous, right? Because it's essentially saying, let's make a new space, a new world, a new type of people, right? A new way of existing. To kind of, wrap that into our final question. We've been talking about how the current media landscape is very broken, right? So that we don't fall into another kind of totalization where it becomes, is all bad, right? From your standpoint, where do you see the possibilities of new modes of radical encounters or imagination or knowledge work in a space where it is, as you said, getting harder and harder to make certain types of lives or questions visible or legible. And then let me fold in social media as well into that, because it's something that we have not really addressed head on, right? Social media used to be the space of radical things. The African Springs, Africa is a country. Social media, it feels like we are jaded about social media as a space. Yeah, me too, yeah. BLM. I don't know, just from your vantage point, what do you see as the possibility for really building another kind of radical imagination in relation to the media?
Not much. Should I go? I'll go quick. So my feeling is very negative. I mean, I feel like I just saw a film the other night. Vice is, what is it called? Vice is poor or something. Vice is broken. It's about the decline of Vice. You know, Vice magazine, the kind of the obnoxious, nihilistic, terrible on Africa. Vice is broke. It's by this guy, Eddie Wang, who's this like hipster chef who had like a place downtown, and then he had a show called Wang's World. He sold a TV show about his life called Fresh of the Boat. Apparently he didn't like it in the end. But in any case, the point of this is by the end, Vice tried to like sell this organic thing that like the culture of young people. He tried to bottle it and then sell it to like Rupert Murdoch, and then it just became about advertising. So the next day I went back to teach about this, and I asked the students, like, what is the Vice of today? Like, where is that, when Vice was still this idea of like, there's a possibility produced to break the glass of legacy media, about how you get information, how you do debate. And they all sort of sound, the first things they mentioned, they said, oh, it's comedians sitting around talking on podcasts. So Theo Vaughn, I think is his name, this kind of right-wing, Joe Rogan, like that's the dominant, the depressing part of it is like people who profess very loudly that they don't read, that just propagate and share untested theories, crazy ideas. They dominate the landscape right now, and that's the kind of what I mean when I said like you sort of depressed and sad by it. The other one is mostly white men who dress up and kind of pretend that they're Hunter S. Thompson. There's a guy called Channel 5. Again, zero research, just I'm asking questions on the street. So that's, I think for me, that's where the sort of depressing part comes from. But as I said also earlier, the thing that some of the other projects that I'm now involved in is becoming really aware that it is visual, the language now is visual. Like people very rarely, you're just walking around with your phone and you're watching. The one organization that gives me hope is Al Jazeera has this thing called Al Jazeera Plus. They invented that in a way, this kind of explainer reel. And for me, they are doing the best, even on Palestine, they're just the best at sort of like intervening in the public sphere, even when it comes to sort of African topics. So I would say for me, they are that way of sort of going around with reels, using visual media. I think there's where I see, if you're just asking like, how do we operate in this now, I think Al Jazeera is showing me where the interesting possibilities are. What is it called? Spaces on Twitter is another space that people are using. Just sort of opening up space, just going live. People, I suppose somebody at this festival probably just whips out your phone and you're filming a panel. And tons of people just sign. If there's a protest, you just start filming. So it's more decentralized. It's a little bit unorganized. It doesn't maybe have an editor like the way we came up with. I'm more excited for what that represents. Unfortunately, it also comes with, I'm saying, Theo Vaughn and Joe Rogan and all this other nonsense, yeah.
Kola's saying we're out of time.
Okay. Can we wrap up? Okay. We actually started late. Do you think we can have like 10 minutes? Oh, thank you. So for you, just before we turn it over to the audience, you have been very close to the Palestinian discourse, right? And you've been very vocal and critical about how the ball was dropped royally by the West in really covering the violence there. In trying to think about what's possible, how did they fail royally? Can you just like tell us how the media in the West failed really badly, and then what's the possibility for something else, a different kind of formulation?
Yeah, I mean, look, the media has always been anti-Palestinian, anti-Muslim, anti-black, all of those things, right? It's always been colonial, nothing new. It's just like the way all these places use money to make new media. I mean, they just revealed that Google was given $45 million by the Israeli government to construct these very particular narratives about Israel versus Palestinians. So it's like, it's been bought to the point that the amount of money that has been poured into constructing this narrative, it's become unfathomable. Of course, on the other hand, the fact that I know about it is also cool. That we know now, some of it has been exposed. And, the failure, and what it makes me realize is that at the end of the day, the war is always the war of the narrative. And the war is always won at the level of narrative, at the level of representational narratives, at the level of history, how you tweak history to your advantage. And the media has now been exposed for doing that to an unforgivable, unfathomable point. New York Times, New Yorker, Atlantic, all the things that people are addicted to, and they will not unsubscribe, they will not stop engaging with it. It's all there. So, and they're using all the tools, all the cool tools, and this is what is depressing, and they've been bought. And I think the only way we can come out of that is to keep the faith, to press on. And one of the things I've been involved in is the Publishers for Palestine project, which is trying in its own way to make interventions into book fairs, interventions into media and publishers and things like that. And one of the things they're very good at is a kind of coalition building. And I think we have to learn from those forms of doing. And the results right now look very, very little, but sometimes you see that there is 50% of the planet that is still extremely worried about what's happening, and they are looking where is the narrative, where is the truth, and that we have to keep the faith and keep educating those people. I used to believe conversion is possible. I don't think I can convert somebody anymore, but I do think that we can build coalitions, build worlds, build stories, build narratives, make books, make films, do work within a cultural, political realm that can give fodder to that 50% that are hungry for it, that need it,
That's a perfect place to close our conversation. Does anyone have a question that they would like to ask our panelists? We can take maybe one question. Yes. Sure, yeah.
I'll have sort of a set of, thanks, this is a great question actually. That is like the black box, if we could figure that out, it would be brilliant. Africa as a country, we were sort of, I don't know if this is being taped, but we talked earlier about Africa as a country has started to do a print publication. I probably should have brought a couple of copies, but it's not, you could see there, how they're grappling around the question of design, what should it look like for me, like loud, like really loud, sort of tabloid style is, I think, the thing that still, it's the one kind of reading that, if you think in terms of a physical newspaper, that still gets people. I think Vice, and I'll just say this little part, Vice, interestingly, had a really good moment. After Vice was criticized about its, went to Liberia and made up stories about cannibals, and they were heavily criticized by this guy, David Carr, who was the media editor of the New York Times, by the way, New York Times, I know. And then, because at the same time, Anthony Bourdain apparently had gone there, and so, oh no, I'm just hanging out in the market, I'm eating food with Liberians, he respected the culture and so on. And people was like, hold up, that's not what's happening in Liberia. And so because they were criticized, Vice actually for a brief minute started producing really good programming that young people could learn about the world, learn about struggles elsewhere in the world, and sort of tap into things that might, grab them so that they can begin to think about how to change their own world. If you go look at Vice's coverage of Black Lives Matter, like in the sort of the fulcrum of that movement, it's really good programming. So, I mean, that again, I'm sort of half answering you. That is, again, moving images. It was like video that they were producing. But I do think I think what you could probably do is do it as like people read something on an iPad that looks like a newspaper. But I'm not sure even papers that have held on very long thinking, oh, maybe we could still convince people to buy or read a physical thing. I sort of feel like, sadly, we've kind of gone past that moment, and the best you're gonna have to do is make things visually interesting, and then somebody reads it on a tablet, rather than reading it physically.
I'm gonna have to, just the quick disagreement here for me is that print culture is thriving than ever before, right? And the problem is, what's thriving is not what we like you and I or Ainehi may want out there. It's just like historical erotic sagas. It's tons and tons of genre fiction and book talk. Now it's like every bookstore has to have the book talk picks, things that have gone viral on TikTok, books that are viral on TikTok. And I was so excited about this before. I was like, oh, cool, I love making videos about books. But those books are specifically historical fantasy, and that's it. And those are the money makers, and those get the most promotion. It's just a constant, So that's the thing that's hard to break. That's the thing where one has a hard time.
And it depends where you are. I mean, we're in New York, which I think people are reading mostly online. If you go, say, for example, I mean, this is sort of related to Africa. If you're on the African continent, you still have a better chance of producing a print kind of magazine, newspaper. People will actually still buy it, read it. I mean, they're still interested in it.
I want to maybe distill some of the things that you guys are saying. Yes. That print is still possible. It's a challenge, definitely. But it'll take kind of rethinking what it is that the content itself. Is there a way to write differently, right? Or is there a way to make the printed thing the object? So it's not as if you are printing to disseminate an idea. There is the idea, but the printed thing is something that you want to keep. So sometimes we think people buy books or buy things because they read it. Not necessarily. Half the time, people buy things because it looks pretty. They buy it because they have an emotional, connection to it. They buy it because they were at a cool event, right? So thinking of the printed thing as just an element in like an ecosystem of possibilities. So the object is lovely and people literally want to pay money to buy the thing, or because the thing is so sensational that you want to read it, or because the printed thing becomes the basis of an event that people go to. They're just moving away from thinking that the printed thing is the end goal, but that is just one aspect of something kind of richer and more complicated, and that it can move from print to digital. So for example, the cover is so deliciously beautiful that it goes viral on Instagram, So trying to go outside the box to think of the objects differently, I think, is one.
They're gonna take my mic away to get me out of here. But the one great example that you just made me think of it, Chimurenga, and you've mentioned Ntone, produced this this kind of, it's like this thick on like Festac, which is the festival that was held in Nigeria in 1977. And what they did was, it looks like a cut and paste job, but it's deliberately designed that way visually. It looks amazing. If you have a chance, try and find what the title is. I think it's just called Festac 77, I think it's called. And it's incredible, using newspaper cutouts, really, to your point about the Panthers, like visuals from that time of Nigeria. The largest delegation at that festival came from the US, was an African-American delegation, like documenting their stories. I mean, so to your point, that's something you want to hold, you want to have, and as you emerge in it, you can come at it from like different directions as you read it. At the same time, no disrespect to them, there was another publication that was produced called Last Day in Lagos, about the photographer. This is terrible, that I forget, an incredible photographer, I've forgotten her name now. But that was produced, I think, by an American publisher, and it's sort of like, it looks like a museum, like something that's produced just, that very expensive looking, and that's just in a museum. Whereas for me, the Chimurenga one looks way more accessible, way more, it's nostalgia. There's something you could take from it if you weren't there. I mean, it's a different kind of publication.
It's richer, and I would say also, just going back to that historical moment that you mentioned, the Black Panthers, going also to study that archive and see ways that it can allow something different here in this moment, and then building on that. But I believe that things like print should not be lost. That even though the world is moving away from those things, part of the radical imagination is taking over places that they have vacated for whatever reason, right? And doing something different with them. But I feel like that's a very laudable project. Thank you so much, Bhakti.
Thank you.
Sean, for hanging out with us this morning.
Thank
you,
I
just
Ainehi.
want to use this opportunity to thank the organizers.
Yes.
FA, Kola, Titi, the amazing entourage that put this together. You guys have done the most, and we're so proud of you. Thank you so much. Thanks, everybody.